So we face the problem that all our mutations here have to run synchronously. Now let's say whenever I click the buttons here on my counter components, I want to wait for, let's say, a second before I actually update the counter. Now I couldn't do that with just mutations, but I can add actions. Actions, of course, another reserved property here in our store, and actually one of the last ones. And here we now set up again functions or methods which are our actions. For example, increment, like the mutation, but there is no conflict because it's a different object. An increment takes the context as an argument. Context will be passed by Vuex automatically. And context basically just gives us access to the commit method, where we then can commit, for example, increment. Now that would make much sense here because we're not doing any async task or anything like that. So we're really just having an extra step where we commit our mutation instead of doing it directly inside of the component. Now this context object we're actually passing to our action here has the commit method because it has a lot of method and properties of our store. It's not exactly the same as our store. We'll see that when we come to modules in one of the later videos. So it's not exactly the same, but it does have the commit method to commit a change. It does give us access to our getters and so on. So we do have access to our store in general, just not to all features, but to all we technically need here. So we can commit therefore. Also, you could use another syntax, and if you only want to use the commit method in this context object, you can use the ES6 feature of destructuring by passing this as an argument, and this will now destructure, should be in parentheses though, and this will now destructure the object we get automatically and will only pull out the commit method in there. All others are lost, but since we don't need them, that's fine. So that's just a quicker way of only getting one property of an object you get as an argument if you only need that one property. So here we can then call commit increment. Now, whilst we do not really save anything by having an action which does this synchronously, it still is a good practice to have actions to commit your mutations and rarely mutate or commit them directly from within your components, though that is possible. And if you never have any asynchronous tasks, you might directly want to use your mutations, as we do right now in our counter components here. But if you have at least a couple of or at least one async task, you might want to consider creating only actions for all the mutations, even if they are not using any async code anywhere, just to have this clear pattern that you always dispatch actions and not sometimes directly commit a mutation in a component and sometimes dispatch an action. But that's just some additional thought. Now, before diving too deep into any best practices, let's understand what we're doing here. So I'll add a decrement mutation action here, and then I want to add async increment action. And async increment, of course, shall also get the commit method, so it's exactly the same as before. But now here, I want to set a timeout and wait for 1 second. And then in the callback of this timeout, so in this function in here, there I want to call commit increment. So it does the same as the normal increment action, but now it does this asynchronously after 1 second, which is the, again, great advantage of using actions. They may run asynchronous code. So here I'll do the same for decrement. And now in another counter, I want to use these new actions instead of the other ones. And generally, I will have to replace map mutations with some way of getting access to my actions. Because as I just said before, I no longer want to use mutations directly in the components. Instead, I now always want to use actions. Though, again, just to highlight it, you only need to do it for asynchronous tasks. For other tasks, you may still use mutations and directly commit them from in here. So, what can we do here? We right now map mutations, but now we want to get our actions. Well, turns out Vuex also has map actions in its bag of useful tools. And map actions works like that. So really just like map mutations, but of course now with the actions.